Well, it's time for week 47 in our 2023 chronological Bible readings, and this week is loaded with great stuff. We are in the book of Acts, and then James and Galatians. And I'm teaching a class on the book of Acts at a local seminary, and I'm loving it. This week, we are in chapters 9 through 16, and there's just so much rich content on those early years of the church. So let's dive in, and we're going to see how James and Galatians are going to come into play with what we're talking about in Acts. Chapter 9, most commonly known as the chapter where Saul of Tarsus is converted. What a great moment. That's going to be somewhere around AD 33 or 34, give or take a little bit there. There's not an exact a date known, but it's roughly around that time period. But also in that chapter, the Apostle Peter is going to heal a man and then raise a woman from the dead. So we are continuing to see these apostolic verifications, if you will, where God is using them to show that these are my men. Chapters 10 and 11, we step away from Saul of Tarsus and we go to Peter in his ministry to the Gentiles. It's a great story there with Cornelius and beyond. And then in chapter 12, we have the execution of the Apostle James. That's John's brother. That was under Herod, but Herod, he doesn't get away with it. We'll just leave it there. In chapters 13 and 14, we come back to Saul of Tarsus, who now is also known as Paul. Now, let me make something clear. Paul did not get a name change. Saul is it's his name, and that's how the Hebrews would know him, but the Gentiles or the Greeks would know him as Paul. It's really that simple. But here's what we have, that first missionary journey around AD 47 to 48. And a note for you, Antioch, there are two of them. The church is at Syrian Antioch. That's where Paul and Barnabas will be sent from. But then there's a Pisidian Antioch. That's one of the cities that they will travel to. But then they're going to arrive back at Syrian Antioch. Just thought I would make that note for you. Then we get to chapter 15. This is AD 49, the Jerusalem Council, because there were some Jews who were teaching that Gentiles must be circumcised. They must keep the law to be saved. And that was thoroughly defeated at the Jerusalem Council. They said justification is by faith alone in Christ alone. Big, big issue. And it was handled rightly. Then we're going to get to the end of chapter 15, and there's a disagreement between Paul and Barnabas. And I know this video is going a little bit longer this week, but I think it's worth the time. Paul and Barnabas disagreed over whether or not to take John Mark on this second missionary journey. John Mark had deserted them earlier on. Here's what it looks like happened. They do not agree on whether or not to take him. So Paul says, I'll take Silas, and they travel one route. Barnabas takes John Mark, and they travel another route. And they do end up back together. I think I can prove that from 1 Corinthians, but I'll wait to deal with that when we get to 1 Corinthians chapter 9, I think next week. Anyway, Acts chapter 16, we see the beginning of the second missionary journey, and that is going to go from AD 49 to 51. Now let's move to the letter known as James. Some people say this was the first letter written in the New Testament. And this would have been the brother of Jesus, the half-brother of Jesus, who wasn't even a convert until after the resurrection. 5 chapters, let's do those succinctly here. In chapter 1, you're going to talk about trials, wisdom, and perseverance. Chapter 2, you're going to see a faith contrasted. Faith that saves is faith that works. Faith that is merely professed and dead is a useless faith. And notice the difference there. Chapter 3, you're going to have a warning about who can become teachers, and then he's going to use some illustrations of making that point, and one of those is about the danger of the tongue. But then we also see the difference between wisdom from above and wisdom from below. Chapters 4 and 5, stern words, but then some exhortations about godly living. Then we move to Galatians, 6 chapters here. And remember, these letters, they didn't have chapter and verse divisions. That's how we have them in our translations of the Bible. But Galatians 1, the very real eternal danger of believing and preaching a false gospel. And Paul minces no words there. He is so deliberate, so serious, because you cannot afford to get the gospel wrong. Chapter 2, this is where he really starts to nail down justification is by faith in Christ, not by our keeping of the law. We can't do it. We are powerless to do that. Now, we don't ignore it, but we recognize it is Jesus' keeping of the law that has given us this access for faith. We believe in him for salvation. We do not trust in ourselves. Chapter 3, well, then why was the law given? Paul's going to explain that. It was never given to save. It was given to expose sin and then to point the sinner to Jesus. It's a great chapter. Chapter 4, we get a contrast between two Old Testament women, Hagar and Sarah, and their sons. Remember Ishmael and Isaac, and that battle between, here's what I can do for you, God, and God says, I reject that, but here's what I can do for you. That's what I accept. Chapter 5, a contrast between walking by the Spirit and walking by the flesh. And then in chapter 6, an exhortation on how to walk pleasing to the Lord at all times and in all things. Whew, that was a little bit lengthier than normal, but I hope that this is an incredible week for you. I'm telling you, folks, these chapters, so rich, sometimes very stern, a lot of warning, but so edifying as well. May God bless you as you read his word and follow him all the days of your life. Grace to you.